3 days of rain and you're miserable. You have a roof over your head, heating, a fridge full of food, a phone with unlimited entertainment, and you're still counting the hours until it stops. Now take all of that away. No roof, no stored food, no dry clothes, just you. In a forest somewhere in prehistoric Europe, 60,000 years ago, in the middle of a rainy season that shows no sign of ending. The temperature sits just above the line that could kill you. Every single thing you need to stay alive gets harder to reach the wetter everything gets. This wasn't a bad week. For most of human history, this was simply what being alive looked like for a significant chunk of every year. We tend to picture ancient humans dealing with the dramatic threats, the predators, the migrations, the occasional standoff with something that has teeth. Rain doesn't make it into that story very often because rain isn't dramatic. It's just relentless, and it may have quietly killed more ancient humans than almost anything else on the entire landscape. Start with the actual mechanism of the threat because it isn't drowning. It's heat loss. Water pulls warmth away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than air does. That number sounds abstract until you translate it into something concrete. It's the difference between sitting in a chilly room and feeling uncomfortable versus sitting in a cold lake and dying. You don't need freezing temperatures for this to become lethal. You need wet skin, a light breeze, and a temperature hovering around 10 degrees Celsius. That's an ordinary summer evening in a huge portion of the places early humans actually lived. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself. It just quietly wins if nobody intervenes. So the first and most urgent problem was never shelter in the abstract sense. It was keeping the body dry enough, often enough, to stay on the safe side of that threshold. This is where fire enters the story, and fire during rain is a genuinely complicated relationship. Wet wood doesn't ignite, wet tinder doesn't catch, and starting a fire completely from scratch using nothing but friction and bare hands is one of the hardest physical skills a human body can attempt. Hard enough that for most of our species' history, plenty of people probably couldn't reliably do it at all, which means the priority was never making fire. It was never losing the one you already had. Ancient groups treated fire less like an event and more like infrastructure, something continuously maintained rather than something conjured on demand. Across cultures with essentially zero contact with one another, the same solution shows up again and again, carrying embers wrapped in slow-burning material. Damp moss, specific tree fungus, bark from particular species that smolders for hours without fully catching. Communities transported live coals across long distances this way, treating the fire less like a tool and more like a living thing that needed feeding, shielding, and constant attention. There's a striking piece of physical proof for how seriously this was taken. When researchers examined Otzi, the roughly 5,300-year-old body preserved in the ice of the Alps, they found a complete fire-starting kit tucked into his belt pouch. Tinder fungus, a striking stone. Extra dry plant material as backup. 5,000 years after the earliest evidence of controlled fire use, people were still carrying dedicated emergency equipment specifically because losing your fire in the wrong conditions was a genuine death sentence. Keeping that fire alive during a storm often became a designated job. Not hunting, not foraging, just sitting beside the flame for hours, feeding it precisely, shielding it from wind and drip, splitting open soaked logs to reach the dry wood hidden inside, stripping bark from birch trees, because birch contains a compound that keeps burning even when wet. This is likely one of the earliest divisions of labor archaeologists can infer at all. Long before anyone specialized in toolmaking or hunting, someone in the group specialized in fire. But fire needs somewhere dry to survive, which brings in the second major strategy, shelter. And the popular image of ancient humans as simple cave dwellers is mostly a side effect of what happens to survive in the archaeological record. Caves preserve evidence well, so caves get studied heavily, so caves dominate the picture we form. In reality, most ancient humans built their own shelters, and even the earliest known examples show a level of environmental problem solving that's easy to underestimate. Structures dating back roughly 400,000 years, long before our own species even existed, show deliberate rain-shedding design. Branches angled specifically to direct water away, leaves layered in overlapping rows, each one covering the seam of the one beneath it, functioning exactly like roofing shingles do today. Nobody taught this to the hominins who built it. They arrived at the same engineering principle a modern roofer uses, purely through observation and consequence. By the time anatomically modern humans were spreading across the globe, these structures had become remarkably sophisticated. Sites in Eastern Europe roughly 15,000 years old show shelters built from mammoth bone, heavy enough to anchor against wind, with hides stretched across the frame and probable insulating layers built in underneath. These weren't places to hide. They were engineered environments built specifically to hold heat in and keep moisture out. And that hide construction points to one of the more underrated innovations in human history: leather. Turning a raw animal skin into something waterproof and wearable involves scraping, stretching, and treating the material with fat or specific organic compounds, then smoking it. The finished result sheds water dramatically better than woven plant fiber, and the cognitive leap required to invent this process is genuinely significant. You kill an animal today. You process the hide over several days. The finished garment protects you from a storm weeks later. That's not instinct. That's planning across a delayed timeline, solving a problem that doesn't exist yet, but absolutely will. Evidence of hide scraping tools in Africa pushes this technology back at least 120,000 years, possibly further. The drive to stay dry appears to have been strong enough, early enough, to produce genuinely complex problem solving well before most of the other markers researchers typically associate with modern human behavior. Beyond fire and shelter sits a skill that gets almost no attention today: reading the landscape itself. Modern life has largely outsourced weather awareness to a phone screen. Ancient survival depended on catching signals hours before a storm ever arrived. The distinct smell that precedes rain, birds flying lower than usual, insects swarming ahead of a pressure change, the shifting color and texture of clouds. None of this was mysticism. It was pattern recognition sharpened by the fact that missing the pattern could genuinely cost you your life. Groups likely made decisions about relocating to higher, drier ground hours before rain hit, based entirely on this accumulated environmental literacy, the kind of expertise that researchers studying present-day traditional communities still find startlingly precise, simply because it was practiced daily and refined across generations. Terrain mattered just as much as sky. Cold air sinks, moisture pools in low ground. The gap between camping on a slight rise versus a shallow hollow could be the difference between waking up merely damp and waking up sitting in several inches of standing water. South-facing slopes dry faster. Dense tree canopy intercepts a meaningful percentage of rainfall before it ever reaches the ground beneath it. None of this knowledge was reinvented from scratch by each new generation. Groups returned to the same reliably good shelter spots across years, sometimes across centuries, which shows up archaeologically as repeated layers of habitation stacked directly on top of one another at a single location. The spot worked. Everyone who used it told the people who came next, human bodies themselves carried adaptations to this constant exposure. The cold shock response, the sharp gasp and cardiovascular jolt that happens when skin suddenly meets cold water, is something researchers now understand becomes measurably blunted with repeated exposure. People regularly exposed to cold water or cold weather show a dampened version of that reflex over time. Ancient humans, wet and cold on a near constant seasonal basis, were living with bodies continuously calibrated by an environment that never offered the option of simply adjusting a thermostat. Populations adapted to persistently cold, wet climates also show distinct metabolic patterns: higher resting heat generation, more efficient use of specialized fat tissue built specifically to produce warmth rather than store energy. This wasn't a different, tougher species of human. It was the same species, shaped continuously by conditions that demanded it. None of this worked well in isolation. Ancient humans survived sustained bad weather primarily as groups, not as individuals. Shared body heat is a measurable, practical survival tool. Bodies huddled together under cover retain warmth collectively in a way no one can replicate alone. Privacy, in genuinely cold and wet conditions, becomes a luxury nobody can afford. Labor during bad weather appears to have been distributed with real logic behind it. Younger, physically capable members maintained the fire and gathered what materials they could. Older members, carrying decades of accumulated environmental knowledge, made the calls about when and where to move. Children stayed at the physical center of the group, insulated by bodies on every side. The group wasn't just a social structure during weather like this, it was functioning as a shared thermal system. This is also why the loss of an elder in a hunter-gatherer group carried weight far beyond grief. Knowledge like which specific bark burns slowly enough to transport an ember, or exactly how a hide needs to be treated to properly shed water, wasn't written down anywhere. It lived entirely in memory and got passed forward through direct teaching. Losing the person holding that knowledge meant losing a piece of the group's actual survival technology, which is very likely one of the reasons care for older, non-productive individuals appears surprisingly early in the archaeological record. It wasn't sentiment alone. It was the rational preservation of information nobody could afford to lose. Rain also disrupted food in ways that demanded constant improvisation. Animals shelter and become harder to track. Roots and seeds go waterlogged or vanish under mud for days. Ancient groups countered this with deliberate storage. Caches of dried meat and nuts kept in cool or elevated spots specifically to bridge the gap between what was available today and what might not be available tomorrow, which is less an instinct and more a form of genuine foresight. And when the rain did arrive, the smartest groups didn't just endure it, they shifted their entire strategy to match what the weather was actually producing. Certain mushrooms fruit rapidly after heavy rainfall. Earthworms surface by the thousand. Freshwater fish move in predictable patterns during flooding. Adjusting to those shifts wasn't a personality trait. It was simply what staying fed required. Put all of it together. The fire treated as infrastructure, the engineered shelters, the invented waterproof leather, the fluency in reading sky and terrain, the physiological adaptations, the tightly coordinated group behavior, the carefully preserved knowledge passed from old to young. And rain stops looking like a minor inconvenience in the ancient world. It looks like one of the most consistent, most demanding forces shaping human behavior across hundreds of thousands of years. It didn't just threaten early humans. In a very real sense, it built them.